everyone, and welcome back to Tea and Lit. In today's video, I'm going to be discussing something that I feel is very important when reading literature. Finding a comfortable place to sit. No, that's not what I want to talk about, but we should talk about that at some point. The thing I want to talk about is the importance of doing some minor research on your authors, the time and place when the books were written. I don't do this with everything, but anything that I'm wanting to like really dig into, really evaluate, really get to know, I will do a very basic Google search, even to look at the copyright page of a book to see when something was published is really important. And I think that the reason it's important is that the artist puts a little bit of themselves in their art, and that is across art forms. I mean that in dance, in orchestra, in sport, in literature, in paintings, whatever the case is. Whatever form of art there is, the artist is leaving a bit of their heart and soul in it. To understand the context in which that person is living and thinking is really important. So it's really difficult for William Shakespeare to do that because we just have so little information about him. But there are some things that we do know that can help us navigate that. We know that he was living in London. He was born in Stratford-upon-Avon, which is about 100 miles from London, so he probably had dreams of the big city like so many other people do, and he was an artist. He wanted to be an actor, he wanted to be a writer, he wanted to be a poet, and so, you know, to recognize a country boy's longing for the big city does help impact how one reads his works. We see that across all things. You know, you can tell when you read something, somebody may be experiencing some processing of abuse or mental health challenges, and how their writing is going to impact how they're presenting that, how they're working through that within themselves. And so I think being mindful both as an author and as a reader of great literature to know the time and place is really important. And also, I think it's important to avoid ethnocentricity, which I think is a huge, huge problem in modern interpretation of literature. We have this view that we shouldn't read certain books because, you know, they have certain words used or certain systems used or certain contexts that don't align with our modern values. And I think it is a massive, massive, massive problem to censor works based on our own views. So I remember I was watching a video from Katie Pfeiffer, I think is her name. One second, I'm looking up her last name. Kate File? Maybe is how you say it. She was talking about some book that was originally written, I can't remember what book it was, but she was saying how it used language that we don't use in our modern day because it is offensive to a particular type of person. And you know, there's conversation. She was an English major, and I think she talked about how it was a conversation. Should we change the translations for these books? And I don't think we should. As a Black person, I don't think we should. As a woman, I don't think we should. But we should be being mindful of how we discuss it. I have a huge problem with ethnocentricity, which is the concept of judging another culture by your own culture standards. And I have a problem with that in modern day culture judgment, and also in judging history and literature from a historical context. You can't, I have a huge problem with the idea of erasing huge swaths of history because people had a different set of vocabulary or a different moral standard than what we have today. Instead, we should read it through our modern lens and discuss it through our modern lens and say, you know, I'm so glad that we have advanced to the point where we don't use these words anymore, or that we've advanced so much that women have overcome, this is what it was like for women in, you know, the 19th century, and thank goodness that they have overcome so that we have the luxuries and privileges that we have now. These were rights that were fought for by our foremothers. And rather than saying, well, you know, I won't read this book because it has women portrayed as weak, or I'm not going to read this book because it refers to Black people by the N-word, or I'm not going, or we should retranslate this book somehow. I think it defeats the original intention of reading old books. If you have a problem with this topic, do not read old books. Just read contemporary literature. If this is something that bothers you, you have no business reading classic literature, because that exists, and the authors are writing for a particular time in a particular place for a particular audience, and it wasn't for you. And so knowing what that context is, I think, is really helpful, because if I were to read a modern book that used certain language or certain tropes, portrayed women in a particular way, or portrayed Black people in a particular way, or portrayed disabled people in a particular way, and it used some of the things that older books have used from, the 20th, 19th, 18th, 17th century, I would find them really, really, really offensive, because we have advanced morally and socially to know that these things are wrong, and they have no business being in modern literature. However, you have to be mindful of the time and place and audience of the authors of the time, and the language that they had at that time, and the topics they were writing about at that time. So one of the things that I don't think I mentioned in The Catcher in the Rye was written in 1945, or published in 1945. I don't know when it was written, but that's wartime. And I remember watching a documentary about baseball. I find baseball to be like the most boring of the big sports. And I've been told it's America's pastime. People loved going out to Wrigley Field during the war. And I was like, well, it's the war. You spend all night listening to make sure that your husband or father or brother's name is not said on the radio as, the deceased for the day. And then you go to Wrigleyville the next morning to watch the game, the next afternoon to watch the game. But after the war, football became a big sport in the United States, because, we had processed through the trauma and violence of the war, that you can endure trauma and violence in sport, is what I'm trying to say. And the thing about The Catcher in the Rye is that it's like so boring for so much of the book. And it's like, well, maybe, it was a time when people needed boring. You couldn't have, grand elven battles against dwarves and great fights, because it was too poignant. It was too on point with what was going on at the time. And so I say that to me, and you really need to know the author's motivation for the writing and the time that they're writing this work, because it impacts the way we read it. Now, if you just want to read casual readers don't have to do this. And I don't research every author, to be honest with you. A lot of most modern literature that I read, I don't even bother doing a pre-reading on the author, because they're operating under the same situation that I am for the most part. They're living in the 21st century. They're navigating a technological world, and their writing is going to be reflective of our standards today. And so even if you do have, really bad tropes about certain types of people, typically by the end of those stories, they're going to have some moral lesson about some character that has evolved in their views of that situation to be more reflective of how we have evolved in our views. So there's often a nice little bow around it, but we don't get that beautiful bow in the works of, Mark Twain or something like that. Avoiding the sensitivities, kind of the visceral reactions that one can have from reading something that is sexist or racist or ableist or whatever, is really, really important, because it takes you out of the context. What you have to do is you have to put yourself into the mind of a person at that time reading the book, and what lessons is the author trying to bring about in this story. And so, and we do sometimes see authors who really break that. Shakespeare, especially. I absolutely love Shakespeare. And I just finished filming my Julius Caesar videos. But Shakespeare does this phenomenally, where he really breaks the mold, particularly on women. I just love the way Shakespeare wrote women and portrayed women. To say, maybe there's something wrong with the social views that we carry. And I just think that's important. You read Tolkien, and I had a very difficult time getting through Tolkien, because he spends so much time articulating the beauty of the Shire. And you have to imagine, Tolkien was around during the First World War. He saw the Industrial Revolution and the pollution of the countryside, and he had a huge problem with it. He had a huge problem with, this strong industrial complex and war and violence against nature and against humanity. And so he presents that in the lives of the hobbits who live these beautiful, simple lives close to the environment, close to each other, taking care of one another, growing their own vegetables. And so knowing what Tolkien's context is really important. If you were to read that in a high-rise in Chicago, you know, you might be like, well, this is so ridiculous. And to him, it was really important. And that was the message he was trying to portray, is the importance of connection with each other, with our world. In conclusion, I'm just rambling now. It is absolutely essential, I think, to really evaluate literature. Not necessarily to enjoy literature, in some ways to enjoy it, but mostly to evaluate literature, to understand the author, to understand the time and the place that this work was written. If you read a book written by a 21st century American, it is not going to read the same as a 16th century Russian, which is not going to read the same as, you know, an 11th century Chinese person. So it's absolutely essential that you take all of these pieces of around the work, the framing of the art, to determine how to best engage with the literature. You can passively read and just enjoy a piece of work without all of that, but I think it's really helpful to know what's going on. And I think that's the case for all art. You know, as for people interested in dark academia, like, it's not just how we view literature, but it's also how we view a painting or a ballet or something. I just wanted to get on here and ramble a little bit about the importance of just doing a minor Google search of your authors if it's something that you're wanting to evaluate. It may shine a light on what you're reading, really, and to avoid the temptation to judge the work by your modern lens. You cannot read anything. You can't read these things if you're not going to kind of be mindful of the fact that the standards, the moral standards of the author at the time are not the same as your moral standards. And don't let that prevent you from getting whatever important lessons there are. These works of classic literature are works of classic literature for a reason. They have some message that needs to be shared, and it may not be a lesson in, you know, the empowerment of women. It may not be a lesson in the freedoms of Black people, but it may be a lesson in, hey, be nice and kind to other people. And so take them as they are and do not judge them too harshly. Being mindful of their limitations, I think, is really essential to the full evaluation and enjoyment of a work of art, particularly in classic literature, because that's what we're talking about here. Thank you for listening to me ramble about this. Goodbye.